The room laughed the moment the single father walked through the door, and nobody there realized they were about to make the biggest mistake of the day. The laughter started quietly at first. A smirk from one candidate, a whisper from another. Then came the comments. "He is here for the tryout," one man asked. "Maybe he got lost," another replied. A few people chuckled. Others did not even bother hiding their amusement. Ethan Walker heard every word. He simply kept walking. The large training facility sat on the edge of downtown Dallas, occupying nearly 20,000 square feet of polished concrete, glass walls, and professional security equipment. Dozens of candidates had gathered for what many considered the most prestigious executive protection opening in Texas. The position paid well into six figures. The client was Victoria Hayes, founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Global Technologies, a company worth billions. Every applicant in the building wanted the job. Most looked exactly the part. Broad shoulders, expensive tactical gear, athletic physiques, sharp haircuts, confidence bordering on arrogance. Then there was Ethan, 39 years old. Simple navy button-down shirt, worn leather boots, no flashy equipment, no designer watch, no attempt to impress anyone. At first glance, he looked more like a mechanic stopping by after work than a man competing for one of the most demanding security positions in the country. A receptionist checked his identification and handed him a visitor badge. "Good luck today," she said politely. Ethan smiled. "Thank you." His voice carried a calmness that seemed completely unaffected by the reactions around him. As he entered the waiting area, conversations continued. "No chance. Look at him. This should be entertaining." Ethan chose an empty chair near the wall and sat quietly. He placed a folder on his lap and glanced around the room. Some candidates stretched. Others boasted about previous jobs. A few discussed military backgrounds loudly enough for everyone to hear. Ethan said nothing. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, morning sunlight reflected off nearby office towers. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and polished metal. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Yet Ethan appeared completely still, as if he existed in a different rhythm than everyone else. Across the facility, Victoria Hayes reviewed applicant profiles from a conference room overlooking the training floor. At 41, she had built a reputation for making fast decisions and trusting her instincts. Those instincts had helped transform a struggling startup into one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. Beside her stood Grant Sullivan, head of corporate operations. "Strong group this year," he said. Victoria nodded while scanning the files. "I need someone reliable, not someone trying to impress me." She continued reviewing names until one file caught her attention. Ethan Walker. The resume looked surprisingly ordinary compared to the others. Several employment gaps, minimal self-promotion, few details about previous assignments. Victoria frowned slightly. "Interesting." Grant glanced over. "You think he belongs here?" Victoria closed the file. "I have not decided." Meanwhile, Ethan checked the time on his phone. A photo appeared on the lock screen. A smiling 12-year-old girl missing her two front teeth. His daughter, Lily. The picture had been taken years earlier, but he never changed it. Seeing it now softened his expression. He remembered her words from breakfast that morning. "You are going to get the job." Ethan had laughed. "You seem very sure." Lily had shrugged. "Because good people should win sometimes." The memory lingered as noise filled the room around him. It had been a difficult few years. Medical bills, long hours, jobs that came and went, sacrifices nobody noticed. Yet through all of it, he never complained. Not because life was easy, because Lily was watching. Suddenly a loud voice echoed across the waiting area. "Candidates, report to the main training floor." Chairs scraped against the ground. Conversation stopped. The room began moving toward a pair of large steel doors. Ethan stood and joined the crowd. As he walked forward, another candidate bumped shoulders with him intentionally. "Try not to embarrass yourself out there, old man." A few people laughed again. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he simply stepped aside and continued walking. The candidate shook his head and smirked. What he saw was an exhausted single father who clearly did not belong. What he did not see was the quiet confidence in Ethan's eyes. The kind of confidence that does not come from ego. The kind that comes from experience. And somewhere beyond those steel doors, the first test was waiting. The steel doors opened with a low mechanical hum, and the crowd of candidates stepped onto the main training floor. Conversations immediately faded. Even the loudest personalities seemed smaller inside the enormous facility. Rows of fitness stations stretched across the room. Obstacle structures rose nearly 20 feet into the air. Observation windows lined the upper level where executives and evaluators could watch every movement below. Ethan Walker entered with the others and quietly took in the scene. The polished concrete reflected bright overhead lights. The smell of rubber mats and metal equipment filled the air. Everything about the place was designed to test limits. A tall instructor wearing a black polo stepped forward. "Welcome to Phase 1. Today is not about muscles. It is not about looking impressive. It is about discipline, endurance, awareness, and control." Several candidates exchanged confident smiles. The instructor continued. "Many of you think you are here to prove how strong you are. Most of you are wrong." Ethan listened carefully. Across the floor, another candidate rolled his eyes. Mason Reed, 6'4", nearly 250 pounds of muscle. Former professional competitor. The same man who had bumped Ethan in the waiting area. He stood with his arms crossed and a permanent smirk on his face. People naturally gravitated toward him. Confidence seemed to surround him like a spotlight. "This is going to be easy," Mason muttered loudly enough for nearby candidates to hear. A few laughed in agreement. The first evaluation began. Candidates moved through a series of timed physical exercises. Running drills, balance tests, reaction exercises, short endurance challenges. Nothing extreme individually. But together they revealed weaknesses quickly. Within 30 minutes, several applicants were already struggling. One candidate stumbled during a balance sequence. Another failed a reaction drill. Others showed signs of fatigue much earlier than expected. Ethan moved through each station without drawing attention. His performance was efficient rather than flashy. He wasted no energy. Every movement appeared deliberate. Every step seemed measured. He never rushed, never showed frustration, never looked at the scoreboard. The evaluators noticed. Some candidates did too. "Who was that guy?" one applicant quietly asked. "No idea," another answered. "But he is still moving like he just started." Above the training floor, Victoria Hayes watched from behind the observation glass. She reviewed notes while occasionally glancing toward different participants. Most applicants behaved exactly as expected. Some pushed too hard. Some tried to show off. Others became distracted by competition. Then she noticed Ethan. Not because he was dominating. Because he was not. He simply remained consistent. Calm. Focused. Invisible in a room filled with people demanding attention. Victoria frowned slightly. Number 27. Grant Sullivan looked at his tablet. Ethan Walker. Victoria continued watching. He is interesting. Down below, the next challenge involved observation and memory. Candidates entered a simulated executive office for 90 seconds before being escorted out and asked dozens of questions about what they had seen. Most focused on obvious details. Furniture, computers, artwork. Ethan quietly completed the exercise and returned to his seat. When the results were reviewed, his score ranked near the top. Several candidates appeared surprised. Mason appeared annoyed. During a short break, Ethan stepped toward a water station. His phone vibrated. A message from Lily appeared on the screen. "Good luck, Dad. You got this." A small smile crossed his face. For a moment, the tension of the competition disappeared. He typed a quick response. "Thanks, kiddo. Love you." Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Your daughter?" a voice asked. Ethan turned. An older candidate stood nearby holding a bottle of water. "Yeah." "How old?" 12. The man smiled warmly. "That explains it." Ethan tilted his head. "Explains what?" "You are not here to impress anybody." Ethan laughed softly. "No, I guess I am not." Before either man could continue, another voice interrupted. "There he is." Mason approached with several applicants behind him. The grin on his face carried the unmistakable confidence of someone used to being the center of attention. "I have been looking for you." Ethan remained calm. "Why?" Mason shrugged. "Just trying to figure out how a guy dressed for a hardware store ended up at a bodyguard tryout." Laughter erupted from a few nearby candidates. Ethan said nothing. Mason stepped closer. "You know what? I will give you credit. Most people would have quit by now." More laughter followed. Ethan simply picked up his water bottle. "Good luck out there." Then he walked away. The response caught Mason off guard. There was no argument. No anger. No attempt to prove anything. Just quiet confidence. For the first time all day, the The smirk faded slightly from Mason's face. High above the training floor, Victoria had witnessed the entire exchange through the observation glass. She watched Ethan return to his position without looking back, watched him ignore the ridicule, watched him remain composed. And although she could not explain why, she found herself paying closer attention to him than anyone else in the room as the next phase of testing prepared to begin. The next phase began less than 10 minutes later, but the atmosphere on the training floor had already changed. The laughter had not disappeared completely. It had simply become quieter. A few candidates were beginning to notice something uncomfortable. The man they had dismissed was still there. Not only was he still there, he seemed completely unaffected by the pressure surrounding everyone else. The lead instructor stepped into the center of the room and raised a clipboard. Phase 2 is about judgment. Several candidates exchanged confused looks. The instructor continued. A bodyguard is not hired because he is the strongest person in a room. He is hired because he makes the right decision under pressure. Large digital screens flickered to life around the facility. Simulated scenarios appeared. Crowded events, executive meetings, public appearances, unexpected disruptions. Candidates would have only seconds to evaluate each situation and determine the safest course of action. The exercise sounded simple. It was not. One by one, applicants were called forward. Many performed well. Some performed poorly. A few allowed their emotions to control their decisions. Others focused so much on appearing aggressive that they missed obvious details. Mason Reed entered the simulation area with the confidence of a man expecting applause. His physical presence remained impressive. His voice carried authority. Several candidates nodded approvingly as he completed the first scenario. Then came the second. Then the third. Small mistakes began appearing. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to catch the evaluator's attention. Mason did not notice. Confidence often hides flaws until someone else points them out. Meanwhile, Ethan waited quietly near the back wall. He listened, observed, said almost nothing. From the observation room above, Victoria Hayes continued reviewing performance data. Every candidate received scores in multiple categories: awareness, adaptability, risk assessment, emotional control. Most results followed predictable patterns. Strong candidates performed well. Weak candidates struggled. Then Ethan's turn arrived. Several applicants glanced toward him. A few smirked. Mason folded his arms and leaned against a railing. "This should be interesting," he said. Ethan stepped into the simulation area. The large screen illuminated his face with shifting patterns of light. The first scenario appeared. A crowded charity event. Hundreds of people. Multiple distractions. Limited information. Ethan studied the situation for only a few seconds before answering. The instructor looked down at his evaluation sheet. Then he looked back up. "Continue." The second scenario appeared. Then the third. Then the fourth. Ethan moved through each one with the same calm focus. No hesitation. No theatrics. No attempt to impress anyone. His answers seemed almost boring at first. Then the evaluators began comparing results. Something unexpected emerged. Ethan consistently identified details others had missed. Potential risks hidden in plain sight. Vulnerabilities buried beneath distractions. The room grew quieter with every scenario. Grant Sullivan reviewed the scores beside Victoria. "That cannot be right." Victoria leaned closer. "Check them again." He did. The results remained unchanged. Ethan had quietly produced some of the strongest situational awareness scores of the day. Victoria stared through the glass toward the training floor below. Interesting. On the floor, candidates prepared for the final exercise of the afternoon. Teams would navigate a complex obstacle course while protecting a simulated executive. Communication mattered. Awareness mattered. Decision-making mattered. Physical strength alone would not be enough. The instructor began assigning groups. By coincidence, or perhaps by design, Ethan and Mason ended up on the same team. Mason immediately looked irritated. "Seriously?" he muttered. Ethan said nothing. The exercise began. Almost immediately, problems appeared. Mason pushed the team forward aggressively. He moved fast. Too fast. Other members struggled to keep up. Important instructions were missed. Communication broke down. Frustration spread. Ethan remained quiet for several minutes. Then he finally spoke. "Slow down." Mason glanced back. "Excuse me. You are leaving gaps." Mason laughed. "I think I know what I am doing." Ethan simply nodded and continued moving. Minutes later, One of the evaluators stopped the exercise. The team had failed to identify a major simulated threat. Points were deducted. Mason looked furious. The evaluator reviewed the footage. Then he paused the screen. Everyone watched. There, in the corner of the display, Ethan could be seen noticing the problem almost 30 seconds before it occurred. He had even attempted to warn the group. Nobody listened. A strange silence settled over the team. Mason's expression tightened. Ethan did not celebrate, did not criticize, did not say a word. He simply waited for instructions. The sun was beginning to set beyond the observation windows when the day's scores were finally posted. Candidates gathered around the digital leaderboard. Some looked relieved. Others looked disappointed. Then whispers began spreading through the crowd. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Several people checked the board a second time to make sure they were reading it correctly. Ethan Walker's name sat much higher than anyone expected. Not at the top. Not yet. But high enough to force people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about him. Across the room, Mason stared at the rankings without speaking. For the first time all day, there was no smirk on his face. And for the first time, the room was no longer laughing at the single father from the waiting area. The leaderboard remained on the giant screen long after the day's evaluations had ended. Small groups of candidates stood beneath it, pretending not to stare while secretly checking the rankings again and again. Ethan Walker's name had become the quiet center of every conversation. Not because he was leading. Not yet. Because nobody could understand how he had climbed so high. There has to be something missing, one candidate whispered. Maybe he got lucky, another suggested. The explanations came easily because the alternative was harder to accept. Maybe they had judged him too quickly. Across the room, Ethan gathered his belongings and prepared to leave for the evening. The facility would reopen early the next morning for the final rounds of evaluation. Most candidates lingered, discussing strategies and comparing scores. Ethan simply checked the time. Lily would be waiting for him at home. As he approached the exit, a voice stopped him. Walker. Ethan turned. Victoria Hayes stood several feet away. It was the first time they had spoken directly. Up close, she carried the same confidence people described in business magazines and television interviews. Sharp, intelligent, decisive, the type of person who rarely questioned her own judgment. Ms. Hayes. She studied him for a moment. You surprised some people today. Ethan smiled faintly. That was not my goal. Victoria folded her arms. Most applicants spend the entire day trying to get noticed. I noticed. A brief smile crossed her face. You do not seem particularly interested in impressing anyone. Ethan considered the observation. I came for a job, not an audience. For the first time, Victoria looked genuinely curious. Before she could continue, another voice interrupted. Of course he did. Mason Reed approached from across the room. Several candidates followed behind him. The tension arrived before he even reached them. Must be nice, Mason said. What must be nice? Ethan asked calmly. Getting everyone excited because you answered a few questions correctly. Victoria immediately recognized the challenge in his voice. Ethan did too. Yet neither seemed interested in escalating it. Mason continued. Tomorrow is different. Tomorrow we stop playing games. Ethan adjusted the strap of his bag. Good. The response irritated Mason even more. You think you belong here? I think I belong wherever I earn the right to be. The surrounding candidates fell silent. Victoria watched carefully. Mason stepped closer. You know what your problem is? Ethan shrugged slightly. Probably several things. A few people laughed despite themselves. Even Victoria fought back a smile. Mason did not. You keep acting like none of this matters. Ethan's expression softened. No, I just know what actually matters. The answer lingered in the air long after he walked away. That night, Dallas glowed beneath a warm Texas sky. Traffic moved steadily through downtown streets while office towers reflected the last traces of sunset. Ethan pulled into a modest neighborhood and parked outside a small brick house. The moment he opened the front door, Lily appeared. How did it go? She asked immediately. Ethan laughed. Hello to you too. She crossed her arms dramatically. Dad, it went fine. Fine means good or bad. Fine means complicated. Lily followed him into the kitchen while he prepared dinner. The smell of tomato sauce soon filled the room. Soft music played from an old speaker near the counter. It was a simple evening, the kind many people would overlook. Yet for Ethan, these moments mattered more than any interview. Do they know how good you are? Lily suddenly asked. Ethan paused. Why would you ask that? She shrugged. Because people usually do not. The comment caught him off guard. Children often notice truths adults miss. Ethan smiled and handed her a plate. That is okay. Why? He sat across from her. Because you do not need everyone to see your value. Lily considered the answer carefully. Just the right people? Ethan nodded. Exactly. Meanwhile, several miles away, Victoria Hayes sat alone in her office reviewing candidate files. Most evaluations matched expectations. Strong resumes. Strong performances. Predictable outcomes. Then there was Ethan Walker. The deeper she looked, the stranger it became. His employment history contained unusual gaps. His references were surprisingly limited. Previous positions revealed almost nothing. It was as if entire chapters of his professional life had been intentionally left blank. Victoria leaned back in her chair. Something felt incomplete. Not suspicious. Just incomplete. She opened his file again and studied the photograph attached to the application. The same calm expression. The same quiet confidence. The same refusal to explain himself. Downstairs, Grant Sullivan entered carrying updated schedules for the final evaluations. Big day tomorrow. Victoria nodded. Especially for Walker. Grant looked surprised. You really think he has a chance? Victoria glanced toward the city lights beyond her office window. I think we still do not know who he is. Back at home, Ethan stood in Lily's doorway long after she had fallen asleep. Moonlight filtered softly through the curtains. Schoolbooks rested on a nearby desk. A half-finished drawing sat beside them. Ethan smiled when he noticed it. The picture showed a father standing beside a little girl. Above them, written in uneven handwriting, were 3 simple words. My hero dad. Ethan looked away quickly, not because he disliked the drawing, because some things carry more weight than applause. The next morning would bring the most important phase of the tryout. More pressure, more scrutiny, more opportunities for people to underestimate him. And somewhere inside the training facility, Mason Reed was already waiting for another chance to prove that the quiet single father did not belong among the strongest candidates in the room. The final day of evaluations began before sunrise. The parking lot outside the training facility filled slowly as candidates arrived carrying coffee cups, gym bags, and the weight of expectations. The atmosphere felt different from the previous morning. Less laughter, less confidence. The rankings posted the night before had forced everyone to take the competition more seriously. Ethan Walker arrived 10 minutes early. As usual, he parked his aging pickup truck near the far end of the lot and sat quietly for a moment before stepping out. A text message from Lily waited on his phone. Go show them who you are. Ethan smiled. Then he locked the screen and headed toward the entrance. Inside, candidates gathered around the schedule board. The final phase would focus on controlled protection scenarios and direct assessment exercises. Nothing had been explained in detail. That uncertainty only increased the tension. Mason Reed stood surrounded by several applicants who treated him like the favorite. He noticed Ethan immediately. Morning, Walker. Ethan nodded. Morning. Mason smirked. Hope you enjoyed your little run. Ethan looked at the schedule. I slept fine. The answer earned a few laughs from nearby candidates. Not at Ethan. At Mason. The change was subtle but impossible to miss. Mason's jaw tightened. For the first time since the tryout began, he was losing control of the room. Upstairs, Victoria Hayes entered the observation suite carrying fresh evaluation reports. Grant Sullivan followed closely behind. Today's scores will decide everything, he said. Victoria nodded while reviewing the schedule. Then her eyes stopped on one particular section. Pair evaluation exercises. Candidates would be assigned partners and rotate through executive protection scenarios under direct observation. She noticed 2 names listed together. Ethan Walker and Mason Reed. Grant noticed it too. That should be interesting. Victoria did not answer. Something about the pairing felt deliberate. The first exercises began promptly at 8 o'clock. Teams moved through simulated environments designed to recreate real-world challenges. Crowded entrances, restricted corridors, emergency evacuations, media interactions. The goal was not aggression. It was judgment, positioning, awareness, and control. Ethan continued performing with the same quiet consistency that had defined his entire week. He never moved faster than necessary, never wasted energy, never sought attention. Evaluators repeatedly marked notes on their clipboards. Meanwhile, Mason performed well physically, but increasingly struggled with patience. Every exercise seemed to become a competition in his mind. Every scenario became an opportunity to prove superiority. By late morning, the tension between the two men had become impossible to ignore. During a short break, candidates gathered near the training floor. Conversations immediately shifted toward speculation. "Who do you think wins?" someone asked. "Mason, obviously." "Maybe. You still doubting him?" Another voice interrupted. "I'm not sure anybody is doubting Walker anymore." The comments spread through the group like a ripple across water. People exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody wanted to admit it openly, but many had started asking themselves the same question. Who exactly was Ethan Walker? Shortly after lunch, the lead instructor called everyone back together. The room immediately quieted. "The final assessment begins now." He paused and looked across the candidates. "This exercise will test control under pressure." A large section of the training floor had been rearranged overnight. Thick mats covered the ground. Observation cameras pointed toward the center area. Several evaluators took positions around the perimeter. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Even candidates who had been talking moments earlier became silent. "Each participant will complete a controlled engagement assessment," the instructor explained. "This is not about dominance. This is not about strength. It is about discipline, timing, awareness, and restraint." Names began appearing on a digital screen. Candidates were called forward one at a time. Some performed well. Others struggled. The audience reacted quietly to each result. Then a new pairing appeared on the screen. Mason Reed, Ethan Walker. For a moment, nobody moved. Then murmurs spread across the room. Candidates exchanged looks. Evaluators straightened in their seats. Even Grant leaned forward upstairs. Mason's grin returned instantly. Finally, Ethan simply stood and walked toward the center area. The contrast between them could not have been greater. Mason looked like the obvious favorite. Larger, younger, more imposing. Ethan looked almost ordinary by comparison. Yet something unexpected happened as they took their positions. Nobody laughed. Not a single person. The room that had mocked Ethan on the first morning now watched him with complete attention. Victoria noticed it immediately. Respect had replaced amusement. Curiosity had replaced dismissal. The instructor stepped between them and reviewed the rules. Both men listened carefully. Mason rolled his shoulders confidently. Ethan remained perfectly still. Cameras focused on the center mat. Evaluators prepared their scorecards. The final assessment everyone had been anticipating was about to begin. And for reasons nobody could fully explain, the tension in the room no longer came from wondering whether Ethan belonged there. The tension came from wondering what would happen next. The training floor became so quiet that the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed unusually loud. Every candidate watched from the perimeter. Every evaluator focused on the center mat. Even the instructors appeared more attentive than before. Mason Reed stood confidently on one side of the assessment area. Ethan Walker stood on the other. The difference between them looked obvious at first glance. Mason appeared larger, faster, stronger. Ethan looked calm, almost relaxed. Yet the closer people watched, the harder it became to predict what would happen. The instructor raised his hand. "Remember the objective. Control. Awareness. Discipline." Both men nodded. "Begin." What followed surprised almost everyone in the room. Mason immediately moved forward with intensity, testing distance and positioning. Ethan adjusted smoothly. No wasted motion. No panic. No aggression. Just quiet awareness. The assessment was designed around controlled engagement principles. Candidates were scored on balance, reaction, judgment, timing, and decision-making. Physical dominance alone earned very few points. Several moments passed. Then several more. Mason increased the pressure. Ethan adapted. Mason changed angles. Ethan adjusted. The exchange resembled a conversation more than a competition. Every movement carried meaning. Every step revealed information. Upstairs, Victoria Hayes leaned closer to the observation glass. "Look at Walker." Grant followed her gaze. "What about him?" "He is not reacting." Grant frowned. "Of course he is reacting." Victoria shook her head. "No, he is reading." The distinction mattered. Most candidates responded emotionally under pressure. Ethan appeared to process information before making decisions. His breathing remained steady. His posture never changed. His eyes never left his surroundings. Several evaluators began writing notes simultaneously. On the floor below, Mason's frustration slowly became visible. He expected resistance. He expected effort. What he encountered instead was patience. The more pressure he applied, the calmer Ethan seemed to become. Candidates watching from the sidelines noticed it too. One whispered quietly, "How is he still so relaxed?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. After several minutes, the instructor paused the assessment and reviewed preliminary scoring. The room buzzed with nervous curiosity. Mason walked toward a water station, visibly irritated. Ethan simply stepped aside and waited. As candidates discussed what they had witnessed, a younger applicant approached Ethan. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Sure. How are you staying so calm?" Ethan thought for a moment. "You stopped worrying about proving yourself." The candidate looked confused. Ethan smiled. When you spend enough years handling responsibility, other people's opinions start feeling lighter. Before the young man could respond, the next phase began. This time the challenge focused on executive extraction scenarios. Teams would guide a designated executive through a series of simulated complications while evaluators measured awareness and decision-making. Victoria Hayes herself would serve as the executive for several of the exercises. The announcement immediately raised the stakes. Candidates straightened. Conversations stopped. Victoria descended from the observation suite and entered the training floor. Her presence changed the atmosphere instantly. She represented the actual responsibility behind the position. Not a score, not a title. A real person whose safety would depend on the decisions being made. Ethan and several other finalists were assigned to separate groups. Throughout the exercises, Victoria observed everyone carefully. Some candidates talked too much. Others focused on appearances. A few seemed more interested in impressing her than protecting her. Ethan remained exactly the same. Quiet, attentive, consistent. During one scenario, a deliberately confusing distraction unfolded near an exit route. Several candidates immediately shifted attention toward the disturbance. Ethan did not. Instead, he calmly adjusted positioning and guided Victoria along a safer path. The evaluators exchanged glances. Another note appeared on multiple score sheets. Later, as candidates moved between stations, Victoria found herself walking beside Ethan for the first time without cameras or evaluators directly observing them. "You have done this before." It was not a question. Ethan smiled faintly. "A few things. You never talk about your background." Nobody asked. Victoria looked at him carefully. "I am asking." Ethan met her eyes for a moment. Then he looked ahead again. "I am here for the same reason as everyone else. To earn a job." The answer revealed nothing. Yet somehow it revealed something too. Victoria sensed layers beneath his calm exterior. Experience. Sacrifice. Stories he deliberately kept private. Before she could continue, another instructor called candidates back together. The final evaluations of the afternoon were about to begin. As everyone gathered near the central training area, Grant Sullivan quietly handed Victoria a folder. Additional background information came in. Victoria glanced at the cover page. Ethan Walker's name appeared at the top. Grant lowered his voice. "You may want to read that." Victoria looked surprised. "Why?" Grant hesitated. "Because I think we have all been looking at the wrong man." Victoria stared at the folder for several seconds before closing it again without opening a single page. Across the room, Ethan stood among the finalists, completely unaware that questions about his past were beginning to spread through the people evaluating him. And for the first time since the competition began, the mystery surrounding the quiet single father was becoming impossible to ignore. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the training floor in long golden lines as the final group of candidates gathered near the central evaluation area. The competition had entered a strange stage. Physical ability still mattered. Scores still mattered. But something else had begun shaping the atmosphere. Curiosity. Nobody was talking about who looked strongest anymore. People were talking about Ethan Walker. Across the facility, Victoria Hayes finally opened the folder Grant Sullivan had handed her earlier. She sat alone in a small conference room overlooking the training floor while candidates prepared for the next phase. The first page contained basic information she already knew. Age, address, employment history. Then she turned the page. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She read another page. Then another. The deeper she looked, the quieter the room around her seemed to become. Grant entered several minutes later. Well, Victoria did not answer immediately. She stared through the glass toward the training floor below, where Ethan stood speaking briefly with another finalist. Why was none of this highlighted before? Grant pulled out a chair. Because most of it is buried behind old contracts, confidential agreements, and incomplete records. Victoria continued reading. This does not make sense. Grant nodded slowly. That was my reaction too. Yet even with the folder open before her, many questions remained unanswered. Pieces existed. Details existed. But the full picture still felt hidden beneath layers of silence. Meanwhile, Ethan remained completely unaware of the growing attention surrounding him. He sat alone near the edge of the training floor, reviewing instructions for the next exercise. Around him, conversations rose and fell in cautious whispers. Candidates no longer mocked him openly. In some ways, that felt stranger than the ridicule had. Respect creates distance just as easily as contempt. A younger finalist approached and sat beside him. Can I ask something? Ethan smiled. Everybody keeps asking that. The young man laughed nervously. Why did you apply for this job? Ethan looked across the facility before answering. Because my daughter deserves stability. The simplicity of the answer caught the young man off guard. That is it. That is enough. The young man nodded quietly. Sometimes the strongest motivations sound ordinary when spoken aloud. Nearby, Mason Reed observed the exchange from across the room. His frustration had evolved into something more complicated. He no longer viewed Ethan as a joke. That realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. For most of his life, physical presence had solved problems. Strength created confidence. Confidence created respect. Yet Ethan seemed to operate according to different rules. Rules Mason did not fully understand. The lead instructor eventually called everyone together. Final team assessment. The room immediately settled into silence. Large digital displays illuminated. Maps appeared across multiple screens. Candidates would navigate a complex protection scenario requiring strategy, communication, leadership, and adaptability. The exercise would last nearly an hour. Mistakes would compound. Pressure would increase. Evaluators would monitor every decision. Teams were assigned. Ethan found himself leading a small group that included candidates from different backgrounds and skill levels. Mason led another team. The scenario began. Almost immediately, challenges emerged. Conflicting information appeared. Routes changed unexpectedly. Simulated threats shifted positions. Teams scrambled to adapt. Several leaders became visibly stressed. Voices grew louder. Decisions became rushed. Ethan responded differently. He listened before speaking, observed before acting. His calm presence gradually spread through his team. Members who had started the exercise nervously soon found themselves working with surprising confidence. Upstairs, Victoria watched every moment. She no longer focused solely on outcomes. She watched behavior, leadership, influence, the effect one person had on others. Again and again, she found herself returning to Ethan, not because he demanded attention, because he never did. During one particularly difficult stage of the exercise, multiple teams received conflicting instructions. Confusion spread quickly. Some candidates argued. Others hesitated. Ethan studied the information for several seconds before making a decision. His team followed without question. Minutes later, evaluators confirmed he had chosen the correct path. Another note appeared on Victoria's score sheet. Another question formed in her mind. Who teaches someone to stay that calm under pressure? The exercise continued into the evening. Fatigue began affecting performance. Candidates who had appeared unstoppable earlier now showed signs of frustration. Mistakes multiplied. Patience disappeared. Yet Ethan seemed almost unchanged. Not because he possessed endless energy, because he managed it carefully. Every action remained deliberate. Every choice remained measured. As the final stage approached, a sudden announcement echoed through the facility. All finalists report to the main auditorium. Candidates exchanged uncertain looks. This had not been listed on the schedule. Conversations erupted immediately. Speculation spread. Nobody knew what came next. Ethan gathered his things and followed the others toward the auditorium. High above the training floor, Victoria closed the folder containing his background information. She looked toward the doorway where Ethan had just disappeared. The questions she carried now were no longer about whether he belonged in the competition. They were about how much nobody actually knew about him. And as the finalists entered the auditorium for what appeared to be the last major evaluation before selection, an unexpected feeling settled over the room. The competition was no longer simply about earning a position. It was becoming a search for the truth behind the quiet man nobody had understood from the very beginning. The auditorium felt different from every room the candidates had entered before. It was quieter, more formal, more final. Rows of seats faced a large stage illuminated by soft white lights. The giant display screen behind the stage showed only a single message: Final Evaluation Review. Nobody knew exactly what that meant. Candidates filed into their seats while instructors and executives took positions along the sides of the room. The energy was heavy with anticipation. Ethan Walker chose a seat near the back. As usual, he had never seemed interested in being seen. Yet ironically, more eyes followed him now than ever before. Conversations hushed when he walked past. People who had laughed at him 2 days earlier now watched him with curiosity. Some with respect, some with confusion. Mason Reed sat several rows ahead. He glanced back once, then quickly looked away. Whatever rivalry had existed between them was no longer simple. Somewhere along the way, certainty had disappeared. On the stage, Victoria Hayes stood alone reviewing a stack of evaluation reports. The folder containing Ethan's background information rested beside them. She had spent much of the previous evening studying it. The more she learned, the more uncomfortable she felt about her first impression of him. Not because she had been intentionally unfair, because she had been confidently wrong. And confidence makes mistakes harder to forgive. The auditorium lights dimmed slightly. The room fell silent. Victoria stepped forward. First, I want to thank every candidate who participated in this process. Her voice carried easily across the room. You were evaluated not only on performance, but on character, discipline, adaptability, and judgment. Candidates listened carefully. Some appeared nervous, others exhausted. Many looked relieved simply to be nearing the end. Victoria continued. The final selection will not be based solely on scores. Murmurs spread briefly before fading again. The role requires trust, responsibility, integrity. The person selected will represent this company every day. Ethan remained still in his seat, yet something felt different. He could sense attention gradually shifting toward him. Not openly, not yet, but enough to notice. Meanwhile, Grant Sullivan stepped onto the stage and began reviewing key performance highlights from the evaluation process. Names appeared on the screen. Individual achievements were recognized. Several candidates received applause. Mason's name appeared multiple times for physical excellence. Other finalists were praised for leadership or technical skill. Then Grant paused. The screen changed. A new slide appeared. No name. Only a list of evaluation categories. Situational awareness, decision-making, threat assessment, emotional control, team leadership, adaptability. Nearly every category ranked among the highest scores recorded during the entire selection process. Candidates exchanged puzzled looks. Who is that? Someone whispered. Grant looked toward the audience. These scores belonged to a candidate many people underestimated. The room became completely silent. Victoria watched reactions carefully. She saw candidates slowly beginning to understand. Some looked surprised. Others looked embarrassed. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. He already knew where this was heading. Grant continued. When we reviewed the evaluation footage, one pattern appeared repeatedly. Calm under pressure. Consistent judgment. Exceptional awareness. Quiet leadership. The screen remained visible behind him. No name yet. No identity. Just evidence. Facts. Results. The kind that speak louder than opinions. Mason stared at the display without blinking. The realization was becoming unavoidable. Victoria stepped forward once more. There is something else. Her voice softened. Over the past 2 days, I learned an important lesson about assumptions. The auditorium grew even quieter. Sometimes the loudest people attract attention. Sometimes the strongest people dominate a room. But occasionally, there is someone whose value remains hidden because they are too busy carrying responsibilities nobody else sees. Ethan felt every eye in the auditorium turning toward him now. Yet he remained exactly as he had been since the first morning. Calm, composed, uninterested in attention. Victoria looked directly toward the back rows. For a brief moment, their eyes met. She saw no pride there, no desire for recognition, only quiet patience. The kind of patience earned through years of sacrifice. Grant returned to the microphone. Before the final announcement, there is one last review process. A collective sigh moved through the room. Candidates shifted in their seats. Tension immediately returned. The finish line remained just out of reach. Executive leadership will conduct individual interviews with the remaining finalists. The screen behind him changed once more. 5 names appeared. Mason Reed. 3 other finalists. Ethan Walker. Murmurs spread again. Victoria closed the folder beside her. The same folder that contained pieces of Ethan's story nobody else had seen. Pieces that explained far more than scores ever could. Yet she said nothing. Not yet. The interviews would happen first. The final decision would come afterward. And as candidates slowly rose from their seats and prepared for the last stage of the selection process, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The man who entered the building as a joke was now standing closer to victory than anyone had imagined. But the most important part of his story had still not been fully revealed. The individual interviews lasted nearly 2 hours. One by one, the finalists entered the conference room overlooking the training facility and answered questions from Victoria Hayes and the executive selection panel. Some spoke confidently. Some tried to impress. Some focused on achievements. Others focused on credentials. By the time Ethan Walker's name was called, the sun had already begun setting beyond the Dallas skyline. He entered the room quietly and took a seat across from Victoria. For a moment, nobody spoke. The folder containing his background information rested on the table between them. Victoria looked at him carefully. Why did you leave your previous career? Ethan already knew the question would come eventually. He looked toward the window for a brief second before answering. Because my daughter needed me. The room fell silent. Victoria nodded slowly. Most people would not walk away from opportunities like those. Ethan smiled faintly. Most people did not have Lily. There was no bitterness in his voice. No regret. Only certainty. The kind that comes from a decision made long ago and never questioned afterward. Another executive leaned forward. Do you ever feel like you sacrificed too much? Ethan thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. Every parent sacrifices something. Mine just happened to be visible. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the folder. Inside were records of responsibilities, accomplishments, and experiences far beyond anything most candidates could claim. Yet none of those achievements seemed to matter as much to Ethan as the simple photo of his daughter on his phone. Eventually, the interview ended. Ethan thanked everyone and stood to leave. As he reached the door, Victoria spoke again. Mr. Walker. He turned. Yes. Her expression softened. Your daughter should be very proud of you. For the first time during the entire process, genuine emotion appeared in Ethan's eyes. He nodded once. Thank you. An hour later, all finalists gathered inside the auditorium once more. The atmosphere felt completely different now. The competition was over. Only the decision remained. Candidates sat quietly while executives took their places on stage. Mason Reed sat near the front. For the first time since the tryout began, there was no arrogance in his posture. Only reflection. The giant screen illuminated behind Victoria Hayes as she approached the microphone. This process challenged every candidate in different ways, she began. But one lesson became clear. True strength is not always loud. True leadership is not always visible. And character reveals itself when nobody is watching. The auditorium remained silent. Victoria continued. The person selected demonstrated exceptional judgment, discipline, emotional control, and integrity. More importantly, he consistently put responsibility above recognition. She paused. Then she smiled. The position is offered to Ethan Walker. For a moment, nobody moved. Then applause filled the room. Not polite applause. Genuine applause. Candidates who had once laughed now stood alongside those who had respected him from the beginning. Even Mason rose to his feet. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. Not by winning. By the reaction. He slowly walked toward the stage while the applause continued. Victoria extended her hand. Ethan shook it. Then something unexpected happened. Mason stepped forward from the audience. The room immediately quieted. He looked at Ethan for a moment before speaking. I owe you an apology. Nobody expected it. Mason took a breath. I judged you before I knew you. I thought strength looked one way. I was wrong. Ethan studied him for a second. Then he offered a small smile. We all get things wrong sometimes. The tension that had existed between them for days disappeared in a single moment. Not through victory. through grace. Later that evening, Ethan pulled into the driveway of his small brick house. The new contract rested on the passenger seat beside him. Warm light glowed through the kitchen window. Before he could reach the front door, it flew open. Lily ran outside. "Well," Ethan laughed. "Hello to you too, Dad." He finally held up the contract. Lily's eyes widened. Then she threw her arms around him. Ethan hugged her tightly as the evening breeze moved softly through the neighborhood. No audience. No applause. No executives. Just a father and daughter standing beneath a darkening Texas sky. Inside the house, Lily eventually noticed the framed drawing still sitting on her desk. "My hero, Dad." Ethan smiled when he saw it again. Not because he viewed himself as a hero, because the person who mattered most already believed in him long before anyone else did. Sometimes life rewards talent. Sometimes it rewards perseverance. But every once in a while, it rewards quiet dignity. The kind that does not demand attention. The kind that keeps showing up, keeps doing the right thing, and keeps carrying responsibility even when nobody notices. And if this story reminded you that true strength often hides behind humility, share your thoughts below. Tell us where you saw quiet courage in your own life. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, redemption, and second chances, stay with us for the next journey. There are still many remarkable people whose stories deserve to be told.